So imagine trying to book a VIP, fully catered private dining room in Paris.
Okay.
But you're trying to do this on the very day of the Olympic gold medal match.
Oh, man, that's just a nightmare right there.
Every hotel is booked. I mean, every single restaurant is overflowing, and you have zero money, no reservation at all.
Yeah, good luck with that.
And to make the situation, completely impossible, let's add that there are political assassins actively hunting you in the streets.
Wow.
You can't be seen, you can't be heard, you just have to somehow make this dinner happen.
That is, yeah, that is quite the setup.
But, I mean, if you are reading the historical accounts of first century Jerusalem, this is the sheer logistical nightmare taking place in Matthew chapter 26.
Yeah, it really is.
Because when you look at the final hours of a condemned man, you expect chaos, right? You expect a ship caught in a hurricane.
Sure, absolutely.
Typically, the prisoner is swept away by the current of the state, just reacting to forces entirely outside their control.
Right, because the authorities possess the swords, the gavels, the chains, the temple guards, all of it.
Yeah, they hold all the cards.
Right. The victim in those historical scenarios is really nothing more than a passive participant in their own destruction. They just get crushed under the overwhelming weight of the governing authorities.
But then you step into the text of the final hours of Jesus of Nazareth.
Yeah.
And that state machinery is just suddenly broken.
Yeah, completely shattered.
We are looking at a historical and theological landscape that presents this massive paradox. Because, the world looks at the final hours in Jesus and sees a tragic, helpless victim.
Right, someone swept away by a brutal Roman execution and a clandestine Jewish conspiracy.
But the text tells an entirely different story. Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today we are going on a deep dive into 3 brief verses. Matthew chapter 26, verses 17 through 19.
Just 3 verses, but they carry so much weight.
Oh, massive weight. Because these verses detail the preparation for the final Passover. And what we will uncover is that Christ was not reacting to human whims.
No, not at all.
He was the sovereign master, dictating the microscopic logistics of his own death.
Yeah, and the narrative here upends all our natural assumptions about who is actually holding the reins of the events unfolding in Jerusalem.
You really have to pay attention to the details.
Right. When you slow down and investigate, you realize this text isn't, just a filler scene before the Passion narrative.
Like a transition shot in a movie or something.
Yeah, precisely. It is a brilliant display of absolute majesty in the midst of extreme humiliation.
So we are going to look at how a seemingly mundane inquiry about a dining room secures the inauguration of the new covenant.
It's going to be fascinating.
Let us unpack the historical context first, because we really can't grasp the scale of these verses without understanding the geographical and political situation of first-century Jerusalem during the Feast of Unleavened Bread.
Yeah, context is everything here.
So set the scene for the listener. What does this city look like, sound like, and smell like in this specific moment?
Well, to understand the sheer impossibility of what Jesus is orchestrating, you have to look at the historical data.
Okay, what do we have?
We have records from the first century Jewish historian Josephus, right? And he documented the demographics of Jerusalem during these mandatory pilgrim festivals.
And what was the baseline? Like on a normal Tuesday in October?
Normally, Jerusalem was a city of roughly 50,000 inhabitants.
Okay, 50,000.
Right. It was a bustling, ancient city with narrow streets and heavy trade, but it was manageable. 50,000 people is a crowd, but it functions.
Sure.
However, during the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, Josephus notes that the population swelled astronomically.
How much are we talking about here?
We are talking about upwards of 2.5 million pilgrims.
Wait, 2.5 million?
Yeah.
From 50,000 to 2.5 million? That's insane.
It is wild. They were crowding into the city proper and the surrounding hillside camps.
2.5 million people packing into an ancient walled city with no modern infrastructure. I mean, that means every single inn, every guest room, every courtyard, and every spare patch of ground is occupied.
Oh, the city was practically bursting at the seams. And remember the primary purpose of this festival.
The sacrifices.
Right, the sacrifices. These 2.5 million pilgrims are bringing hundreds of thousands of lambs into this city.
Oh, man. The noise must have been deafening.
Absolutely. The noise of bleeding animals, the dense crowds, the smoke from the altar fires, and the logistical strain on the city's water and sanitation systems would have been suffocating.
I can't even imagine the smell.
Yeah, and the Temple Mount would have been literally a river of blood as the priests worked continuously to process the Passover lambs.
So in the middle of all that chaos, finding a vacant, furnished upper room in Jerusalem
Yeah.
on the specific day of the Passover preparation without prior, rigorous, and expensive arrangements.
It was an absolute logistical impossibility.
Which brings up a massive point from our source material regarding the financial status of Jesus.
Right, a very necessary point to clarify.
Because the sources highlight that Christ possessed no earthly estate. He owned no property at all.
None. She had nowhere to lay his head.
Right, and he had to borrow a room for this monumental final meal. This directly confronts and refutes modern claims made by prosperity preachers who suggest that Jesus operated with vast financial resources.
Yeah, the source text is very explicit about his financial poverty. The prosperity gospel claims that Jesus lived a life of affluence, but the biblical narrative utterly rejects that premise.
Completely.
In his earthly ministry, the Son of Man relied on the hospitality of others. He embraced poverty to secure the salvation of his people.
So he didn't just walk in and drop a bag of gold on the table to rent this room out.
No, not at all. He didn't purchase this room with gold or leverage a wealthy estate. He secured it by divine decree.
And the type of room itself is significant, right? The text specifies an upper room.
Yes. The Greek term is katalema, or an upper room, which was an architectural luxury.
How so?
Well, in ancient Near Eastern homes, an upper room was often built on the flat roof of a house. It offered a breeze, it offered privacy away from the noise of the street.
Which, with 2.5 million people, you would desperately need.
Right. It was reserved for honored guests. So, for a penniless itinerant teacher to secure one at the peak of the festival requires something far beyond human planning.
Okay, so we have a desperately overcrowded city and a penniless teacher. But let us add gasoline to this fire.
Let's do it.
Let us look at the threat level. Because this isn't just a busy holiday weekend. This is a highly volatile security situation.
Oh, the socio-political tension is off the charts. You have Pontius Pilate and the Roman occupiers on high alert.
Where was Pilate normally stationed?
Pilate would normally travel from his comfortable headquarters out in Caesarea Maritima down to Jerusalem specifically for this festival.
Just for crowd control.
Basically. He stationed himself in the Antonia fortress, which physically overlooked the temple courts.
So he is literally looking down at the crowds.
Right. The Romans knew that zealot uprisings and rebellions frequently ignited during these nationalistic festivals.
Because the Jews are celebrating their deliverance from Egypt. They are celebrating freedom from a previous empire.
Precisely. When Jewish fervor was at its absolute peak, remembering their historical deliverance from Egypt, the Romans had their swords drawn. They were ready to crush any hint of an insurrection.
So you have the Roman military just waiting for someone to light a match.
Exactly.
And the threat is not just the Romans. You have internal threats coming from the highest levels of the Jewish religious establishment.
Oh, the Jewish religious elite, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the ruling Sanhedrin, they are actively, venomously conspiring to murder Jesus.
So the atmosphere in Jerusalem is thick with espionage, political maneuvering, and visceral hatred.
Yeah, they want him dead, but they're terrified of the crowds.
Because a lot of those pilgrims still view Jesus as a popular prophet.
Right, so they need a quiet, secluded place to arrest him without triggering a riot that would bring those Roman swords down on all of their heads.
Which brings us to the ticking clock. The immediate, visceral crisis happening right off screen. Judas Iscariot has just made a deal.
The crisis is incredibly immediate. Judas has just contracted with the chief priest to hand Jesus over.
And the price they agreed upon is 30 pieces of silver.
Yeah, 30 pieces of silver.
Right, let's stop right there because the significance of that specific amount is staggering. 30 pieces of silver is not just a random number Judas negotiated.
No, it's highly specific.
What does that mean in the historical context of the Old Testament law?
Well, under the Mosaic Law, specifically in Exodus chapter 21, 30 pieces of silver was the legal compensation paid to the owner of a slave if that slave was gored to death by a neighbor's ox.
Wow. So it was the price of a dead, mangled slave.
Yes. That is the insulting, degrading value the religious leaders placed on the Son of God.
And Judas accepted it.
He did. And now Judas is desperately looking for a clandestine opportunity to fulfill his end of the bargain. He needs to hand Jesus over away from the sympathetic crowds.
So Judas is literally standing right there, blending in with the disciples, waiting for the itinerary.
Just waiting.
He is waiting to hear where they're going to eat so he can slip away, run to the temple guard, and give them the coordinates for the arrest.
The tension is suffocating. You have Roman swords, religious assassins, a traitor in the inner circle, and a city of millions.
It's a powder keg.
This is the precise context in which we must read Matthew chapter 26.
So if the city is a powder keg and Judas is holding the match, why doesn't the explosion happen on the Sanhedrin's timeline?
That's the big question.
Because when you look at the literary structure of Matthew 26, the author sets up a massive clash of decrees.
The immediate literary context of Matthew 26 is a masterful, divinely orchestrated display of sovereignty, violently juxtaposed against the darkest depths of human wickedness.
Walk us through that juxtaposition.
Well, the chapter opens with Jesus explicitly predicting his own crucifixion.
Right.
He says, "You know that after 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified."
So he anchors the precise timeline of his death to the Passover feast. He makes a definitive declaration about when the event will occur.
But then, in sharp contrast, the camera pans over to the palace of Caiaphas.
The high priest.
Right. The religious leaders are having a secret high-level meeting, and they explicitly scheme to arrest him by stealth, stating, "Not during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people."
Notice the stark contrast between these two decrees.
It's huge. The enemies of Christ plan to avoid the feast at all costs to prevent a riot.
But Christ decreed that his execution would happen precisely on the feast to fulfill the Old Testament typology.
Yeah, and here's where the natural tension arises.
Right, because if the Sanhedrin has the temple guards, the political leverage, the financial resources, and the weapons, how is it that a penniless itinerant teacher dictates the actual schedule of his own execution?
Exactly. From a human perspective, Caiaphas has all the political capital. Why does Caiaphas lose this scheduling conflict?
Yeah, how does that happen?
The answer lies in divine providence. Christ's sovereign decree prevailed over the schemes of the religious elite.
So the victorious decree does not belong to the high priest in Jerusalem.
No, it belongs to the great high priest of heaven. God's redemptive plan cannot be thwarted, delayed, or rescheduled by human plotting.
The Sanhedrin wanted a quiet execution after the pilgrims went home.
And Jesus decreed a public execution during the feast to demonstrate that he is the true Passover Lamb.
The decree of Jesus completely crushed the strategic plans of the Sanhedrin.
It did. And the narrative is structured so brilliantly around this theme of preparation.
There is a narrative symmetry here that is impossible to ignore. You have Judas preparing to betray the Lord. You have the unnamed woman at Bethany with her alabaster flask preparing Christ's body for burial.
And now the disciples are preparing the Passover. Every single actor on the stage is moving toward a cosmic collision.
It is a complete, tightly constructed narrative block.
The author deliberately transitions the reader from the public ministry into this intense, highly private setting. Judas prepares treachery. Christ prepares redemption.
Let us get into the actual text of verse 17. The disciples come to Jesus with an inquiry. They ask, "Where will you have us prepare for you to eat the Passover?"
The Greek verb used there for prepare is hetoimazo. It is a crucial thematic word that indicates readiness and subjection.
What's the significance of them asking rather than telling?
Notice what they do not say. They do not say, "We found a great place, let's go there." They do not presume to choose the location.
So they recognize his absolute authority over their logistics.
Right. They are entirely subjected to his will.
Then Jesus answers them in verse 18 with a command. Go into the city to a certain man. We have to pause on that phrase, a certain man, because the original Greek language here does something very specific.
Yes, it does. The Greek word used here is dina. It translates as a certain one or so-and-so.
So-and-so. That's really vague.
What makes this fascinating is that it is highly unusual. In fact, this is the only occurrence of the word dina in the entire New Testament corpus.
Wait, stop right there. I have to push back on this. You are saying Jesus is orchestrating a secret drop-off to avoid Judas.
Yes.
But Jesus is God. He has all authority. If he wants to eat uninterrupted, why play this cloak and dagger spy game with a cryptic so-and-so address?
That's a fair question.
Couldn't he just miraculously blind Judas? Or freeze the Roman guards? Why rely on this secretive logistical maneuvering?
That is a fantastic question because it gets to the core of how Christ operates as the mediator.
Okay, unpack that.
Christ is indeed God, but he is also truly man, fulfilling the law on behalf of humanity. He does not use his divine attributes to cheat his own human suffering or bypass the necessity of walking through human history through the avenues of normal providence.
So he has to play by the rules of humanity, essentially.
Yeah. Right. He must actively obey the law, which includes observing the Passover. He uses his omniscience to guide his disciples, But he does not blast away every obstacle with raw divine interference.
Because if he says the name out loud in front of the group, Judas has his window.
Precisely. By withholding the man's name, he keeps the location absolutely secret from Judas until the last possible second, utilizing providence and human obedience.
Because if Jesus says, go to the house of Simon the Tanner on the west side of the city, Judas simply slips away, runs to the chief priests and says, I had the location, send the guards.
Exactly. The Last Supper would be raided before the bread was even broken.
Wow.
This masterful maneuver, using this cryptic instruction, ensures the Last Supper, the institution of the New Covenant, and the final high priestly discourse in John chapters 13 through 17 can proceed completely uninterrupted.
This specific moment puts something massive on display regarding the nature of Christ, the theological concept of the hypostatic union.
It really does.
Unpack the how and why of this concept for us, because we see it happening right here in a conversation about booking a room.
The hypostatic union refers to the two distinct natures of Christ, his true humanity and his absolute deity united in one person, without mixture, confusion, separation, or division.
And we see both natures active here.
In this passage, we see both blazing forth simultaneously. In his humanity, Jesus has a physical need. He requires a physical room to eat a meal. He experiences genuine hunger.
Right.
Furthermore, he is only hours away from agonizing physical death. His human body will bleed, suffer, and die. He feels the very real human dread of the impending cross.
That is the human side, the physical limitation and the impending suffering. But then we see the deity operating in the exact same moment.
In his deity, he demonstrates unmitigated omniscience. He knows the exact movements, the exact chores, and the exact location of an unnamed man in a chaotic city of millions.
It's like he has a satellite view of the entire city.
Yeah, and in the parallel accounts in Mark and Luke, Jesus tells them they will meet a man carrying a jar of water.
Which was unusual, right?
Very. Carrying water was traditionally women's work, making this man highly identifiable in the crowd. He knows the man has a furnished upper room. He commands the unseen circumstances from afar.
So this is not a lucky guess.
No, this is the omniscience of the Creator knowing the exact state of his creation.
The tension there is staggering. You have the agonizing tension of Jesus' humanity, knowing the pain of the cross via his omniscience, yet purposefully walking into it anyway.
It is incredibly intense.
He is hungry.
Yeah.
He's omniscient. He is about to be arrested, yet he is commanding the city. That leads us right into the message. He tells the disciples to deliver to this unnamed man.
Right. The message is key.
Jesus says, my time is at hand. Let us look at the theology of time here, because he is not just talking about the dinner hour.
The concept of time in the biblical text is vastly different from how we often perceive it today.
You know, I was trying to think of how to explain this distinction to you, the listener. It is the difference between checking your watch to see the passing minutes, just the mechanical ticking of the clock, versus the moment a judge strikes a gavel in a courtroom to deliver a verdict.
Oh, that is a phenomenal analogy.
Because one is just tracking seconds, right? But the other is a singular, decisive, world-altering event. The gavel drops and reality changes entirely.
The gavel drops and reality changes, and the Greek text actually backs up your gavel analogy perfectly.
Really?
Yeah. When Jesus says, my time is at hand, he does not use the word chronos. Chronos refers to passing chronological time, the ticking of the clock you mentioned.
So he's not saying it's 6:00 p.m.?
No. Instead, he uses the word kairos.
Kairos.
Yeah.
A completely different category of time.
Yes, kairos. This word denotes a divinely appointed epoch. It signifies a decisive crisis in redemptive history.
A moment decreed before the foundation of the world.
Exactly. Throughout the gospel accounts, Jesus repeatedly says, my hour has not yet come. He slips through hostile crowds. He evades premature arrest because the kairos had not arrived.
But now, the king issues the final decree.
My kairos is near. The cross is not a tragic accident. It is the apex of the divine kairos.
If this is the kairos, the appointed epoch, we have to look at what is actually being fulfilled in this upper room. We are moving from shadow to substance.
That's a massive shift.
Trace that redemptive historical progression for us, going all the way back to Egypt.
Well, to grasp the magnitude of this Passover meal, we have to look backward 1,500 years to Exodus chapter 12.
Okay, take us there.
On the night of the final plague in Egypt, the Lord commanded the Israelites to select a spotless lamb, slaughter it, and apply its blood to the doorposts and lintels of their homes using a branch of hyssop.
Right, the original Passover.
When the angel of death passed through the land of Egypt, it saw the blood and passed over the house, sparing the firstborn.
So the blood was a covering.
Yes, and since that night, millions of lambs had been slaughtered in Jerusalem. Rivers of animal blood flowed from the brazen altar every single spring. But all of it was a type. It was a shadow.
It was a graphic, bloody illustration pointing to something greater.
Because the blood of bulls and goats could never actually take away sins.
Right.
Those old covenant sacrifices were a temporary shadow pointing forward to the ultimate substance. They were a placeholder until the true sacrifice arrived.
Let us talk about the actual mechanics of the Passover meal itself, because Jesus is about to completely override a 1,500-year-old tradition.
He is.
What did this meal look like, and how does he change it?
The traditional Jewish Passover meal, the Seder, followed a very specific liturgy.
What were the elements?
It involved the consumption of the roasted lamb, bitter herbs to recall the bitterness of slavery, unleavened bread representing the haste of their departure from Egypt, and 4 specific cups of wine representing the 4 promises of redemption in Exodus 6.
So it was a highly structured memorial.
Very rigid. But when Jesus sits down in this upper room, he takes the elements of the Passover, the bread and the cup, and he radically repurposes them.
Oh, so?
He takes the bread and says, "This is my body." He takes the cup and says, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins."
Wow. He makes himself the center of the meal. The substance has finally arrived in the upper room.
When Jesus sovereignly arranges this final Passover, he is declaring the termination of the shadow and the arrival of the substance. He is the true Lamb of God. He is establishing the new covenant right there at the table.
This connects directly to the doctrine of definite atonement.
It absolutely does.
His sovereign preparation points to his active, vicarious obedience. Explain the how and why of definite atonement in this context.
Well, Christ was not a helpless martyr taken against his will. He was the great high priest actively offering himself on the altar.
He is in control.
Yes, he willfully submits to the exact requirements of the law on behalf of a specific people. And notice the massive upgrade in the redemption provided.
Compared to the Exodus.
Right. The blood of the Passover lamb in Egypt only saved the Israelites from the temporal wrath of the destroying angel. It saved their physical lives for one night.
It was temporal salvation. It did not save their souls. But the true lamb does something entirely different.
The blood of Jesus Christ saves from eternal wrath. It satisfies the justice of God completely. This establishes a finished, once-for-all sacrifice.
So there's no need to keep doing it.
Exactly. The sources point out that this reality actively refutes the concept of a perpetual, repeated sacrifice. When Christ died, the veil of the temple was torn.
It was done.
He arranged this meal to institute the memorial of a completed atonement. He is not being sacrificed again and again. It is finished.
What does this all mean for the disciples standing there listening to him give these instructions? Let's look at verse 19.
Okay, let's look at it.
It says, "And the disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover." The verb used there for directed or appointed is syntasa. What is the nuance of that specific word?
Syntetes is a strong term. It implies a strict military command or a divine ordinance.
It's not a suggestion.
No, it requires absolute, immediate, and unquestioning compliance. It is the kind of word used for an army lining up in rank and file based on the general's orders.
And that is exactly what we see happening in the text. The disciples did not form a committee to discuss the budget for the room.
No, they didn't.
They did not run a demographic focus group to see which neighborhood in Jerusalem would yield the best optics or be the most seeker-friendly for the meal.
Right, they didn't look for a cheaper room on the outskirts of town to save money either.
No, they yielded absolute, unquestioning compliance to a command that, frankly, sounded incredibly cryptic and counterintuitive.
They recognized the voice of the commander. The historical sources apply this directly to modern church practices. The text radically repudiates pragmatic approaches to worship and obedience.
Let's break that down. What does that mean in this context? Let's talk about the regulative principle. Why does human pragmatism fail, and how do the disciples act as a blueprint here?
Pragmatism relies heavily on sociological data, marketing algorithms, and human ingenuity to determine how the church should operate.
Like trying to figure out what works best for the crowd.
Right. It looks at the cultural data, the perceived needs of the audience, and decides the methods based on what seems most effective to human eyes.
But that's not what the disciples did.
If the disciples were pragmatists, they would have argued with Jesus. They would have said, Lord, sending us to find a random guy with a water jar is a terrible strategy. Let us just go to a reliable innkeeper we know.
Yeah, that would make more sense logically.
But the standard presented in Scripture, which the disciples embody here, is the regulative principle.
And the regulative principle dictates that if God has not commanded it, the church has no business doing it. We worship and obey based solely on biblical warrant, not human creativity.
Spot on. The disciples did not engineer human events to aid God's kingdom. They heard the clear directive of the Word of God, and they executed it flawlessly.
Because the sovereign God requires no pragmatic assistance.
Human pragmatism fails because it assumes we know better than the Creator how to reach His creation. The disciples act as a blueprint for the church. God decrees, and His servants obey even when the command seems contrary to human logic.
Let us consider the original audience reading Matthew's Gospel. Matthew is writing to first-century Jewish Christians.
A very specific audience in a very specific trial.
These are people who are being actively hunted. They are facing severe persecution from the Jewish religious establishment. They're being kicked out of their synagogues, ostracized by their families, losing their businesses, and being threatened with imprisonment.
It was a brutal time.
When you are reading this text in that environment, it is so easy to miss the sheer panic of the situation. Think about it. If you were one of those early Christians, you would be terrified.
Absolutely.
How does reading an account about Jesus booking a dinner reservation help them survive that kind of fiery trial?
Well, it provides the most massive pastoral comfort imaginable. This is the anchor of providence. Yes, think about the fear those early Christians faced on a daily basis. They might be tempted to believe that the Roman Empire or the Sanhedrin held the upper hand. The world looked chaotic, violent, and entirely out of control.
Just like it looked when Judas was quietly making his deal for 30 pieces of silver, while everyone else was completely unaware.
Exactly. But Matthew intentionally inserts this explicit demonstration of Christ's absolute sovereign control right before the horror of the Passion narrative.
To show who is really in charge.
If Jesus is the sovereign Lord who can perfectly control an unnamed man with a water jar in a crowded city of millions, orchestrating a secret meeting during the chaotic Passover festival to execute his own redemptive timeline,
then he certainly controls the raging persecution facing the early church.
Yes. He holds Caesar in his hands, he holds the Sanhedrin in his hands, he holds the local synagogue leaders who are persecuting them in his hands.
Yeah.
He is never caught off guard by their suffering. The application for the original audience was unshakable comfort. Their suffering was not a sign that God had lost control or abandoned them.
It was superintended by the sovereign king who ordains all things for his glory and their good.
Precisely.
Think about how this applies to your own life today. We look at the news, we look at the culture raging around us, and the world often feels completely chaotic.
It really does.
It feels like the machinery of society is just crushing everything in its path. You might be facing financial ruin, illness, or relational breakdown, and it feels like you're being swept away by the current.
But this text proves that God is never caught off guard. His kairos, his appointed epoch, is always on schedule.
And the sources challenge us with a very specific application here. You are called to abandon autonomous planning.
That's a hard pill to swallow for a lot of people.
We are so prone to act like pragmatic planners, relying entirely on our own wisdom, our own bank accounts, and our own strategies to secure our future.
Right, trying to control the uncontrollable.
But the call here is to trust his kairos, to execute his commands precisely, just like the disciples did, without fear of the hostile surroundings.
When you realize that the Lord of the Passover is the Lord of your circumstances, it strips away the panic.
It brings peace.
It demands a restful trust in his timing and a zealous obedience to his word. You do not need to manipulate your circumstances to survive. You need to obey the command of the king and trust his providence.
We have covered massive ground today. To briefly summarize, we took what seemed like a mundane logistical conversation about securing a room for dinner, and we saw the majestic calm of the Savior.
It's just an incredible narrative.
While the geopolitical world raged, while traitors plotted, and while the religious leaders conspired in secret, Christ was actively orchestrating his own substitutionary sacrifice. Every detail, down to the unnamed man in the overcrowded city, bowed to his decree.
The cross was not an accident. It was the flawless execution of a divine rescue mission.
Caiaphas thought he was in charge.
Right, and Judas thought he was making a shrewd financial deal. but they were simply instruments in the hands of a sovereign God who was securing the salvation of his people.
And that leaves us with a final thought for you to mull over as we close. If the darkest, most unjust and violent event in human history, the crucifixion of the sinless Son of God, was flawlessly orchestrated down to the minute by divine decree to secure the greatest good the world has ever known, how does that reality force you to reinterpret the confusing, seemingly out-of-control hardships in your own life today?